If you walk into a grocery store today, you are looking at a mirage. It is a beautifully engineered, climate-controlled illusion of absolute abundance. We have been trained to believe that the cherries from Chile, the avocados from Mexico, and the endless rows of boxed cereal will always be there, resting under the bright fluorescent lights, waiting for a swipe of a plastic card. But anyone who has ever managed a supply chain knows the terrifying truth. The modern grocery store does not have a backroom anymore. It does not have warehouse storage. What you see on the shelves is all there is. It is called just-in-time logistics, a highly optimized, razor-thin system designed to maximize profit by keeping inventory in constant motion. Ships, trains, and semi-trucks are the real warehouse, perpetually moving across highways and oceans. If those wheels stop turning for just 72 hours, the shelves go bare. Completely bare. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a mathematical certainty of modern civilization. And yet, when we talk about preparing for this vulnerability, the conversation immediately devolves into caricature. We think of extreme preppers in underground bunkers, hoarding freeze-dried military rations that cost thousands of dollars, waiting for an apocalypse that will probably never come. We mock them, or we ignore them, because the entry barrier to being prepared feels absurd, expensive, and deeply paranoid. But while the public is busy debating or ignoring the fragility of our food supply, two massive, highly structured organizations have spent the last half-century quietly studying this exact vulnerability from completely different angles. The first is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They are cold, bureaucratic, and highly analytical. Their entire mandate is to prevent civilian panic and maintain public order during catastrophic failures of infrastructure. They do not care about spiritual salvation. They care about sheer logistics, caloric intake, and preventing civil unrest. The second is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church. They are a deeply tight-knit, highly organized religious global network. For over a century, their leadership has preached self-reliance not as a survivalist hobby, but as a core theological duty. They operate their own massive welfare system, their own orchards, their own grain mills, and their own distribution centers. These two organizations have almost nothing in common. One is a secular, slow-moving arm of the federal government. The other is a highly disciplined religious community built on 19th-century pioneer heritage. They do not share a worldview, they do not share a budget, and they certainly do not share a belief system. And yet, if you look at their official guidelines, if you strip away the bureaucratic jargon of FEMA and the theological language of the LDS Church, you discover something genuinely startling. Both organizations have independently arrived at the exact same list of 12 emergency foods. They did not do this by copying each other. They did it because they both ran the same math on human biology, shelf stability, and supply chain collapse. They spent decades researching what a family actually needs to survive when the lights go out, the trucks stop running, and help is not coming. And their joint conclusion is going to shock you. It is not dehydrated space food. It is not expensive survival buckets. The items on this list are incredibly cheap, completely unglamorous, and almost certainly sitting in your neighborhood supermarket right now for less than the price of a cup of coffee. But the real reasons these 12 specific foods were chosen are not what you think. They are not just about keeping your stomach full. They are about managing human psychology under extreme stress, preserving physical capability, and maintaining morale when society begins to fracture. Even more fascinating is the food sitting at the very top of their list. It is an item that is entirely misunderstood by the average modern consumer. It is not even ready to eat. In fact, it requires you to change how you think about preparedness entirely, shifting your household from a simple consumer of food to an active producer of it. We are going to dissect all 12 of these universal survival foods, starting with the items that seem almost too simple to matter, and working our way down to the final 3, where the true genius of these two organizations' research becomes undeniable. Because when the federal government and one of the most organized, self-reliant communities on Earth agree on a blueprint for survival, you do not ignore it. You pay attention. To understand why these two organizations arrived at the exact same point, we have to look at the historical wreckage that forced their hands. They did not develop these lists in comfortable academic seminars. They developed them out of sheer panic moments. When the American food supply chain actively fractured, the story of the Mormon Church's obsession with food storage begins in the spring of 1936. The United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. Unemployment was hovering near 20%, crops were rotting in fields because farmers could not afford to harvest them, and bread lines stretched for blocks in every major city. In Salt Lake City, church leadership watched as their members increasingly turned to federal relief programs. To the church's president, Heber J. Grant, this dependency on the federal government was a structural threat to the community's survival. On April 6, 1936, Grant officially launched the Church Security Program, which was later renamed the Welfare Program. The directive was simple. The church would build its own parallel agricultural economy. They did not just preach self-reliance. They bought thousands of acres of farmland, constructed massive grain silos, built dairy processing plants, and established what they called bishop's storehouses. These were physical warehouses stocked with basic staples, designed to feed families who had lost everything. Church agronomists and nutritionists spent years calculating the exact minimum resources required to keep a human being alive and working. They ran feed trials, analyzed caloric density, and tested storage materials. By the mid-20th century, they had codified their findings into a strict mathematical formula. Each adult needed 400 pounds of grains, 60 pounds of beans, and a specific allocation of fats, sugars, and milk products to survive for 1 full year. While the church was building its private agricultural safety net, the federal government was running its own parallel calculations under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. In 1950, President Harry S. Truman signed the Federal Civil Defense Act, establishing an agency tasked with preparing the American public for a Third World War. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, government researchers realized that in a nuclear exchange, the primary killer of the civilian population would not be the blast itself, but the immediate collapse of the food distribution network. When President Jimmy Carter consolidated these scattered civil defense agencies into FEMA in 1979 under Executive Order 1-117, the focus shifted from fallout shelters to modern logistics. FEMA's engineers analyzed the physical geography of the American food supply and realized they were looking at a geographic trap. This trap is built on extreme centralization. In the early 20th century, most Americans ate food grown within a 50-mile radius of their homes. Today, the average ingredient on an American dinner plate travels over 1,500 miles from farm to table. We have concentrated our food production into highly vulnerable geographic choke points consider the Imperial Valley in California and the agricultural fields of Yuma, Arizona. This single arid region, fed entirely by the heavily over-allocated Colorado River, produces over 90% of all winter leafy greens consumed in North America. If a severe drought, a salinity crisis, or an infrastructure failure shuts down the canals supplying this region, the fresh vegetable supply of the entire continent halts within days. The meat supply is even more centralized. 4 multinational corporations control over 80% of the beef processing market in the United States. Just a handful of massive facilities in states like Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado process tens of thousands of cattle daily. During the supply chain disruptions of 2020, when just 3 of these facilities shut down due to workforce illness, grocery stores across the nation experienced immediate meat shortages. The system has no built-in redundancy. It is designed solely for maximum economic efficiency, which makes it incredibly fragile. This fragility is compounded by the transport corridors. 60% of all grain exports and a massive portion of domestic agricultural transport in the United States rely on the Mississippi River barge system. When water levels drop due to summer droughts or rise during spring floods, barges run aground and the flow of grain stops. The alternative is rail, but the American rail network operates at near maximum capacity on any given day. FEMA's logisticians ran the simulation numbers repeatedly. They looked at the interstate highway system, where 92% of all agricultural products are carried by semi-trucks. These trucks rely on a continuous, uninterrupted supply of ultra-low sulfur diesel. If a cyber attack or physical disruption knocks out the pipeline infrastructure feeding fuel to the East Coast, truck stops run dry within 36 hours. Once the trucks stop, the grocery store's empty. Modern supermarkets operate on a just-in-time replenishment cycle. Because commercial real estate is expensive, supermarkets do not hold back stock. They rely on daily deliveries calculated by automated inventory software. If a delivery truck is delayed by 48 hours, the store has nothing left but specialty items and condiments. This is the geographic and economic trap that both FEMA and the LDS Church spent decades trying to solve. They realized that the federal government does not have the warehouses, the trucks, or the personnel to feed 330 million people if the primary logistics network fails. FEMA cannot save you in the first 72 hours of a systemic collapse. The only solution was to decentralize the storage. Both organizations realized that the safest warehouse is not a massive federal depot, but the individual pantry of the average citizen. By shifting the burden of storage to the household, they could mitigate the panic that turns a temporary supply disruption into a societal crisis. But to make this strategy work, they had to identify foods that could bypass the vulnerabilities of the modern supply chain, foods that required no refrigeration, had shelf lives measured in years, and could be acquired by any family for pennies. That is how they built the list of 12. The friction between federal emergency planning and corporate market efficiency is not a future problem. It is a daily, structural war. At the center of this collision is a fundamental contradiction in how we value resources. To a private corporation, food sitting in a warehouse is dead capital. It represents an inventory tax, storage overhead, and depreciating value. To a federal logistician or a community organizer, that same idle food is the only thing standing between civil order and absolute chaos. In 2020, this contradiction was laid bare during the early weeks of the global supply chain crisis. While consumer demand for basic shelf-stable goods spiked by over 400% in a matter of days, the physical infrastructure of the food industry ground to a halt. The bottleneck was not a lack of raw agricultural yield. Field crops were abundant, but the processing pipelines had been tuned so tightly to specific commercial channels that they could not adapt. Consider the dairy industry during this period. Because restaurants, hotels, and schools shut down overnight, the demand for bulk commercial dairy collapsed. At the same exact time, grocery store shelves were completely stripped of family-sized milk cartons and powdered milk. Because industrial processing plants are built with highly specialized, rigid machinery, they could not easily reroute bulk raw milk into retail-sized consumer packaging. The result was a tragic economic paradox. Dairy farmers across Wisconsin and Ohio dumped millions of gallons of fresh milk into manure lagoons, while urban families faced strict purchase limits on dairy products. This is the exact point where the decentralized LDS model outperformed the federal apparatus. While FEMA scrambled to coordinate with commercial distributors and private transport companies, the church activated its own parallel, closed-loop network. Because the church owns its own processing plants, its own canning facilities, and its own regional distribution hubs, it did not have to negotiate with commercial middlemen. They bypassed the commercial bottlenecks entirely, shipping millions of pounds of basic, shelf-stable staples directly to local centers. The weakness of federal dependency becomes even clearer when analyzing the physical packaging of these basic foods. Take canned meat, canned vegetables, and canned fruit, items 4, 6, and 7 on the combined list. These items represent the primary source of preserved nutrition for millions of households. Yet, the entire domestic canning industry relies on a highly consolidated manufacturing pipeline that is exceptionally vulnerable to external shocks. The United States produces over 25 billion cans of food annually. But the raw steel and aluminum sheets used to make these cans are processed at just a few heavy industrial facilities. In recent years, supply chain researchers have pointed out that a major cyber attack on just 2 major domestic packaging manufacturers would halt the production of canned goods across the entire continent within 2 weeks. Without the physical containers, the agricultural harvest cannot be preserved, regardless of how much corn, beef, or fruit is pulled from the fields. This vulnerability is not theoretical. During the severe winter storm that struck Texas in February 2021, the localized failure of the electrical grid immediately cascaded into the agricultural sector. Water treatment plants lost power, meaning food processing facilities could not sterilize their equipment. Cold storage warehouses lost refrigeration, forcing operators to discard thousands of tons of frozen and refrigerated inventory. The road networks froze, preventing delivery drivers from reaching distribution hubs. For the average citizen caught in the middle of that freeze, the reality of food access changed within 12 hours. Those who relied on the standard consumer routine of buying fresh food every 3 days were suddenly left with whatever was in their kitchen cabinets. In many cases, this meant a collection of highly processed, nutritionally vacant snacks. This event proved on a massive scale the analytical premise that both FEMA and the LDS Church had established decades prior: when the external system fails, your household is an island. The analytical tension between nutritional science and economic reality is particularly obvious when looking at the quality of protein available to the public. While nutritionists agree that high-quality, complete protein is essential for physical recovery and cognitive function under stress, the commercial food market continuously pushes consumers toward cheaper, carbohydrate-heavy alternatives. Highly processed, grain-based convenience foods are cheap to produce, easy to ship, and incredibly profitable for manufacturers. But a diet built exclusively on cheap, refined carbohydrates leads to rapid physical degradation, particularly for adults over the age of 50. The loss of muscle mass, known clinically as sarcopenia, accelerates rapidly during periods of physical stress and inadequate protein intake. This is why canned fish and meats, alongside dry beans and lentils, are treated with such high priority in institutional storage guidelines. They are not treats. They are critical biological interventions designed to prevent physical collapse when physical labor is required. Yet, the market forces that shape our daily lives actively discourage this level of preparation. The modern real estate market, with its emphasis on high-density urban living and smaller apartment square footage, has systematically reduced the physical capacity of households to store goods. The classic walk-in pantry has been replaced by minimalist kitchen cabinetry. The average urban apartment holds less than 7 days of total food reserves. We have traded physical resilience for aesthetic minimalism and geographic convenience, leaving millions of people exactly one logistics failure away from a severe crisis.